Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the experience of fisheries management and area-based conservation in the North East Atlantic from the perspective of the North East Atlantic Fisheries Commission, which is a regional fisheries management organisation on the other side of the Atlantic from Fred, who've already spoken to you. Why Fred and I are here, I think, is firstly to explain our area-based management as an example of balancing economic objectives with conservation or sustainability objectives. We're here as another sector that is extracting value from the sea. The other aspect for those of us from fisheries is actually to better understand how our sectors, mining and fisheries, might interact if such activities as mining ever occur in the same area as fishing activities. I'll start by just showing you our geographical convention area. The regulatory area is in the high seas, but you can see we cover from the North Pole down to a line which is sort of equivalent to the bottom of Spain. And these are our fish stocks. I'm sure you're not greatly interested in fish, apart from perhaps eating some of these, but these fish are worth about $3 billion a year in value. So they are quite a valuable resource we're harvesting from the sea. And in terms of their economic value for our contracting parties, which are listed there, certainly for the Faroes, Greenland and Iceland, they're really central in their economies. For Norway also, a very important sector, fisheries. And for the European Union, Russian Federation and the United Kingdom, they are really important in terms of certain coastal communities' economies. So we also value these resources we're harvesting from the sea. We also have objectives that include sustainability and conservation, and that's the sort of thing that we're balancing in our work. Under the UN Fish Stocks Agreement of 1995, there's a structure for all the regional fisheries management organisations. These are the ones that cover some fish species, in particular the pelagic fish species that are associated in coastal areas and also in international waters, and deep sea fisheries as well, of course, which is what we're getting onto. But that agreement in 1995 drove a lot of development of the RFMOs, both in terms of area and also in terms of legislation. In thinking about management of fisheries, it's pretty similar for all of the RFMOs. We all get scientific advice each year, and we work together on developing that advice and then working from that to management decisions based on legally binding measures that control the level of extraction. And these measures not only include quota limits to fishing, but technical measures, so spatial measures and temporal restrictions. And we also have legally binding measures to control the activities in the fisheries, so monitoring, control and enforcement, and we have at sea and at port inspections. So we know where our vessels are at all times, really, when they're doing their fishing activity. As I've said, science is the first essential step to drive rational decision-making in fisheries. And NIAFC is pretty unusual amongst all of the RFMOs that we're entirely dependent on independent and sole scientific advisor. That's the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, who we pay for advice. And we have an MOU with ICs. And in our performance reviews also, we have always underlined the importance of the independence of ICs as another intergovernmental organisation and the clear separation of a scientific advisor role and then the policy management side that NIAFC does as an RFMO. ICs gives us advice, which again is about maximising the amount of fish we can extract from the seas without affecting their long-term productivity. And it advises us also on the impacts on the ecosystem that we need to take into account. As I said, ICES is an intergovernmental organisation, and its scientists are provided by its member states to the many working groups within ICES. But the data comes from those member states and also comes from NIAFC and through research voyages. I don't really like organisational charts, but I thought I'd just show you this because it shows that ICES has its own process leading up to its advisory committee, which makes the ultimate decisions on its advice, but it has a lot of work done through various working groups. We, on the other hand, have our Permanent Committee on Management and Science, which has a role in discussing the advice from ICES in terms of making sure that it's clear and making advice requests. But ICES is always responsible for its own advice, which ultimately is presented at the NIAF Commission and retaining its independence from us. And we think this is absolutely an essential part of our setup, and NIAF is bound to take the advice from ICES for all its decisions. I've mentioned already that in terms of our objectives, we have the economic ones and the social ones, but we also have the ones related to biodiversity. So the things that we tend to look at in particular are our focus on deep sea fish stocks and sharks to make sure that we're managing our impact and keeping those fisheries sustainable. But also another focus is the protection of vulnerable marine ecosystems, VMEs, which again, you're all familiar with, sponges and corals. In terms of these deep sea habitats, NIAF started its considerations of them early in the year 2000, and that was parallel to an increasing interest in this issue at the UN General Assembly. And in fact, the early closures in NIAF in 2005 preceded the first UN General Assembly resolution on deep sea fisheries and bottom trawling, which happened in 2006. So over the last 15 years or so, NIAF has both increased the areas it protects from bottom contact fisheries, as well as improving the regulations it does it in. So I'll talk you through some of the elements of that. One element of that was establishing the footprint of existing fisheries. So from about 2010 onwards, we looked at the historic footprint of fisheries between 1987 and 2007. And in this map, you can see both the NAFO side, which Fred has spoken about, but our side, you can see the blue areas. These are areas that have had intensive fishing activity for a long period, and in some ways could be considered the least risk areas for activity. But then looking at these blue areas, we needed to then build in also the science that we were getting in terms of what vulnerable marine ecosystems were in those areas. Just to mention, the brown areas are telling you that where the shallower areas are. So again, the more productive fishing areas with current technology. This slide shows you how our process has evolved. And this is showing you that actually, in 2006, we started with quite small areas being closed to bottom fishing. And as the evidence developed, we continued to increase those areas. And those areas are not just in the deeper areas which haven't had much fisheries, but actually you can see from the maps from 2010 onwards, those little green areas are the existing fishing areas. And you can see that we're also closing areas within those existing fishing areas based on the best available scientific advice from ICES, whether VMEs are occurring or are likely to occur. So we also have a precautionary element built into the advice. So several of NIAF's closures are not based on identification of specific individual vulnerable marine ecosystems, but rather on the likelihood of VMEs being in there. And you can see there's some quite large areas closed as well, again, on this basis. And then, so if you look at this map, this is the sort of final form of the recommendation, which is a binding legal measure, 19/2014, and that's setting out these big areas in red that are marked as closed areas, so no bottom fishing is allowed in there at all. The green areas where existing fishing is allowed, except for the areas which are marked in red. And then looking at the overall areas marked in yellow or orange, that's areas that are restricted areas. So that means bottom fishing can only start in these orange areas if it has a 2-year period of exploratory fishing, which I'll explain. But effectively, we've got 98% of our regulatory area in the high seas is closed to fishing, either through closed areas or through these restricted areas. In terms of understanding how we go about identifying the areas. The actual binding recommendation I talked about has lists of VMEs by species and habitat, and also by physical elements. So these are the agreed basis we have with ICES that we should decide whether VMEs are there or not. And then that's handed over to ICES to assess from data from research, from encounters with VMEs, etc., etc. So that's the basis written into the recommendation itself. We also have encounter protocols. So that means if a vessel is fishing anywhere in the areas where fishing is allowed, they encounter either corals or sponges, they have to stop fishing and move on from that area. And that means that we have a process that allows us to be active and understand where we do have impacts, where we don't expect them. And as you can see, the threshold for encounters has gone down and down in 2014 to its lowest levels. We haven't had many encounters over the threshold, if any, I think, but we have encounters below the threshold, which then go into the scientific evidence base for ICES to give us advice on. I've mentioned that we have these exploratory fishing requirements. So in the restricted areas, that before any fishing starts there, there has to be notifications to the Science and Management Committee with harvesting, mitigation, monitoring and data collection plans. And then if these are approved by the Commission, exploratory fishing can carry on for a period of 2 years. And again, all the information from that fishing and observers are required on those vessels will then be taken into account before the exploratory fishing can become a more normal fishing activity, i.e. an established fishing area, but that will have had to take into account if there have been any encounters with VMEs. We get advice each year from ICES on the VMEs. So every year they will look at existing closures, assess whether they need to be changed due to new evidence coming on of VMEs. So that's an annual process. Generally, there will be new information, but sometimes ICES, as in this case, will say, we have found some new information, but we still don't think you need to change the existing areas. They also give us advice on fishing activity in those areas. So if they think that there's some evidence related to bottom fishing in the closed areas or in the restricted areas, again, they will alert us. And we look at that through our own monitoring, control and enforcement systems as well. And we're improving that to make sure that we really do target the vessels that break the rules. And then the last note from the ICES advice is that where ICES advice looks at an increasing an area, so far from what I've seen, NIAFC is very responsive. So in 2017, area L, Hatton Rockall Basin, was significantly enlarged by NIAF following advice from ICES in that year. So again, I see that there is a response from NIAF to the scientific evidence as it's set out in our own recommendations. Beyond that, we also have a 5-yearly renewal of all the areas. So every 5 years, all the areas under the recommendation are renewed, unless there's scientific advice against doing so. And we also have a 5-yearly review of the whole recommendation to see how effective is it in terms of protecting vulnerable marine ecosystems. And that process was happened in 2019. The Commission concluded it was effective, but nevertheless, the Commission also agreed that it needed to improve monitoring control and revisit some earlier decisions not to close certain areas. So we have a very tight process to keep the recommendation live and accurate. That's the main part of the presentation over, but just to mention in a couple of slides, we in NIAFC are not the only ones regulating in the high seas. Of course, there are others, OSPAR in the Northeast Atlantic, IMO and ISO, of course, globally. And cooperation is essential where these activities are overlapping in the same seas or can influence each other. And just one example of a mechanism that we have in the Northeast Atlantic is the collective arrangement, which was set up to include any organisation operating in the Northeast Atlantic in the high seas. At the moment, we have had several meetings with organizations, including ISO and IMO represented by Secretariat, but mostly it's been NIAFC and OSPAR working closely together. So this is a fairly informal process really to share data and information together on our area-based management. And again, that helps us improve our systems. So thank you very much for the invitation to the workshop, and I'm really happy to be involved in the session so far in the last week and in the rest of this week, and wish ISA every success for the workshop. Thank you.